Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 307. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And today, we're going to help make some athletes some money because I am here with the agent to the stars, at least that's what I'm calling her, Ms. Sara Rafferty. Sara, how is it going?
It's going awesome, Steve. Thank you for having me. And wow, quite the intro. I've never been called that before, but I'm happy to wear the crown. Why not?
Well, it's factually accurate as far as I'm concerned, but maybe this part of the story is best coming from you. Why don't you tell everyone a bit about yourself and the athletes that you work with? Because I think that's going to touch on the topic that we cover here today.
Sure. Yeah. Well, my name's Sara. I live in Orange County, California. I started training jiu-jitsu in, I would say, 2016 or so. More seriously in 2017. Before that, lifelong athlete, played competitive soccer my whole life and was kind of looking for the next way to carry out my athletic part of my identity. Anyway, I found jiu-jitsu, and I would say that jiu-jitsu has taken me through a lot of twists and turns in life, as I'm sure is very commonplace with everyone who trains, right? And I would say, trying to think of the year, maybe 2022, 23 is really when I got into the space that I'm in now of helping professional athletes, specifically women, navigate the business side of their career. And I got into that through an introduction to, I would say, I'm gonna give credit to Meg He, Margot, Brianna St. Marie, and Adele Fornerino. I met them at a very interesting time in my life, and they were all in very interesting times in their lives as well. And we all met and became very close friends. And throughout our friendship, we organically became kind of a yin and yang to one another, where they just took off athletically. Their careers were skyrocketing. They were all growing so much on the mats. And subsequently, their business opportunities started increasing. I have a pretty extensive corporate background. I have been working in private equity, fund management, technology operations for 11 to 12 years now. Most recently, I've been sitting in a leadership seat at an S&P 500 company. A lot of fancy words thrown in there, Steve, but just the long and short of it is I have a lot of knowledge around entrepreneurship, business transactions, negotiations, and through our friendship, we really started just piggybacking off of one another and coming up with ways to help each other. So that's how I got here. That's how I got in this seat. I help Margot, Brianna, and Adele with sponsorships, contract negotiations, brand deals, anything that's off the mats that they need an opinion on, they ask for my help. And it's been really fulfilling. I've really enjoyed it. And I think that there's a ton of opportunity to really formalize this in the jiu-jitsu community, specifically in the professional grappling area. And the reason that I say that is because there's not a lot out there. There are not a lot of people helping out in a formal capacity. I will tell you, I've been helping out in an informal capacity for the majority of this. It's really just been, hey, can I bounce this off of you? And more recently, it became more formal where I started just taking things off their plate instead of, having them field the requests on their own, which sometimes they still will do. which is totally fine. We just really kind of go with it. But more recently, we've stepped into a more formal, hey, just this goes to Sara, which is great.
Awesome. Well, the reason I know you is because, as you mentioned, you went through a lot of names there of people who, if they've listened to this podcast or used our premium service for a while, they will absolutely recognize those names. And it got to the point where one person that I was working with said, hey, can you get Sara to help me out with this? So I started talking to you. And then another one of our sponsored athletes did that. And it got to the point now where I think over half of our sponsored athletes are actually represented by you. And that was just a complete fluke. It's not like we went in with some project of infiltrating your team and taking all your athletes. Just randomly, there were, out of all of the people on our roster and the people that we wanted to work with, it just so happened that a bunch of them are represented by you. You mentioned Brianna St. Marie, Margot Ciccarelli, Meg He, Adele Fornerino, probably soon. These are all people who either are sponsored athletes of BJJ Mental Models, or they are on our coaching team and help provide reviews to our premium subscribers, or some combination of the two. And so you and I have kind of gotten to know each other over the last few months, because with ADCC and CJI happening, there were a bunch of sponsorships that we did there. And we, of course, talked to you about that. And the one thing that really stuck out in my mind when talking to folks like Brianna and Margot and Adele is how important it was to have you on their team and how helpful it was. Jake O'Driscoll, right? Adele's jiu-jitsu coach. We just had an episode with him that we did on our premium service, and he just went on about how amazing you are.
Oh, that's so nice of him. Thanks, Jake. Appreciate it.
And this kind of got me thinking that there's a whole thing here that I think we can really shed some light on to help a lot of athletes out. Like, you can be the best jiu-jitsu competitor in the world, but if you don't know how to represent yourself, or if you don't have the time to do so, which is completely understandable, you're really running at a disservice. And I'm constantly shocked when I talk to a lot of really well-known athletes about how little infrastructure they have in place when it comes to representation. They normally work out some handshake deal with, some person directly, and there's not a lot of thought put into what's fair. There's rarely any real negotiation done. And I'm kind of coming away with this thinking that there's a lot of athletes out there, not even the big names, but even kind of the local regional heroes, they're probably not making as much money as they could be because they're settling for bad deals. Like, we'll give you a free gi, or we'll give you some supplements, whereas in reality, they should be giving you some money. And I'd love to maybe talk a bit more about this and your thoughts on the athlete competitive landscape and where the monetization opportunities are.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question, Steve. So first, I'll clarify. So these athletes started as my friends, and the athletes that I'm working with in a formal capacity are Brianna, Margot, and Adele. And I would say that specifically for those three, and then for a few other folks that I help kind of on the side, there's a variety of ways to make money. And I think one of the keys to being successful in my contributions to this is I care a lot because I know them well, and I'm not in it to, I have skin in the game because I care about them and they're my friends, and I want what's best for them. And from an athlete standpoint, it's really hard for them to advocate for themselves because it's so personal, and they haven't really been taught how to negotiate necessarily, because negotiation is a skill, just like jiu-jitsu. It's a completely separate skill. Fortunately for me, I have 12 years of experience in it. I do it all day, every day, in the workplace, outside of the workplace, change agent. To me, it's second nature. Like jiu-jitsu is second nature for them. I think the key ways for them to make money are asking for it is step one. And a lot of times athletes don't know that they can ask for it. So knowing that you can ask is a key, right? I would say that's one key to success. Now, because it's so personal and it's so difficult to ask for money in general, like, hey, I am giving you a service, or I am giving you exposure, or I am giving you posts on Instagram, or I am giving you like a space on my rash guard, for example. Asking for that in exchange for money that's a business transaction, right? And it should be treated as such. But it's really hard for athletes to do that because it's so personal to them, and they're focused on performance, and they're focused on their camp, and they're focused on, growing their following. And they're essentially a small business as an individual athlete. And that comes with a whole host of skills that athletes might not have that they have to learn. In addition to learning jujitsu, performing on and off the mat, taking care of their body, focusing on their nutrition and things like that. So to tie all of that in, asking for it is the first key. And then secondarily, I would say a key to negotiation is viewing it as a partnership and understanding that you can grow with whomever you're negotiating with. Instead of thinking as, okay, this is kind of a quid pro quo, this for that. I want this thing, you want this thing, let's get the deal done. Focusing on building a relationship and focusing on partnership with that company will give you a lens that'll allow you to navigate the transaction better. As an example, when we were talking about BJJ Mental Models, what you guys are doing is really impactful to the community. And that's something that athletes want to be a part of. So that's kind of a no-brainer. But if we're thinking of something like, a gi brand, for example, or a supplement company, thinking of this as, okay, I want to go into partnership with this organization. And then thinking about long-term, like, okay, what does year one look like? Do we want this for a year? Do we want this for less than a year? Do we want to try them out for 6 months before we commit to going into a 1-year partnership with them? Those are all questions that you want to ask before you actually go into the negotiation exercise. And I think that that's really important because that's actually going to drive how the conversation goes. If you're just thinking about it like, okay, I want to make $500 a month, right? And I want to do a couple posts and receive free stuff and then, get my tournaments paid for. That's cool and all, right? That's super important, right? Happy days. Let's make some money, good stuff. But if you take it a step further and think about, okay, if I make $500 a month with this company in year one, what can year 2 look like? What can year 3 look like? How is this company or organization that I'm talking to growing on their side? Is their company doing well? Do I see them around at tournaments? Do I see their ad space on Flow Grappling? How much money are they making? Are they a brand new gi company? Are they a brand new supplement company? Am I going to be the face of their company? What other athletes are involved with them? Those types of research pieces are super critical to crafting what the partnership looks like. So again, to kind of back up from how I started this rant, it's beyond the, okay, let me get paid every month. It's beyond that, although that's super important. It's, am I going to get paid every month for year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, or is the company going to fold in 6 months? Right? So those are the types of questions and things that we like to ask and the research that we typically do when we're talking to sponsors. And then, I can get into like contractual stuff and negotiations for matches and things if you want, but just off the top of my head, thinking through how we navigate negotiations from a sponsorship standpoint, we really try and look like from a 35,000 foot view at the whole thing instead of just, okay, this company is offering me, X dollars per month, and this company is offering me Y dollars per month. We like to look at the whole thing.
One of my favorite books on the topic of negotiation is the classic Getting to Yes. Really awesome book. And
that's a good one.
I'm sure you've read it too. One of the things that it talks about is the importance of inventing options for mutual gain when you're negotiating. And that's exactly what you just described. This idea that when we go to the table to negotiate with someone, it's not us versus them, it's us and them. How can we collaboratively work together to come up with a proposal that works for both of us? And I think this is a reason why having an agent or some sort of representation in jiu-jitsu is tremendously important, because combat sport athletes will understandably look at every transaction as a win or a lose, right? They're competitors. They are used to a situation where one of us wins, one of us loses. If I win, that means I took the win away from you. If you win, that means you took the win away from me. But negotiation doesn't work like that. And if you look at a business relationship in that manner, what you'll often find is those are the worst, most toxic relationships you'll ever see.
100%.
Yeah. If someone ever tries to negotiate with you and it's very clear that they want to get as much out of you as they can right now, and that's their goal coming to the table, you want to run for the hills. That is a red flag when it comes to negotiation. You want to look for people who will partner with you and are not just willing to invest in you, but are interested in seeing you succeed And then you create a symbiotic relationship with them over time. And this very much comes up with athletes. I think a lot of people would look at sponsoring an athlete as a waste of money because they'd say, well, how much business am I really going to get if I can convince Brianna St. Marie to slap my logo on her gi or on her rash guard? How much money am I really going to make out of that? But that's not what it's about. It's about a long-term relationship with that athlete. I mean, I can tell you as an example from my perspective, when we sponsor an athlete, I have zero expectations that people are going to see their logo or social post and think, oh, I got to go give BJJ Mental Models some money. But that's not why we do it. The reason we do it is because through these long-term partnerships, I know now that I can rely on these athletes to help me out in the future as well. And that's tremendously valuable, right? I mean, if I have a guest on, for example, who's supposed to record with me and something goes wrong, they get COVID and they have to bail out at the last minute, I know that I can probably send a message to one of our sponsored athletes just begging and saying, does anyone have time in the next 24 hours to bang out an episode? And they can probably save my ass. I mean, Brianna, Margot, I think some of the others have done that before. It can be very hard to schedule with athletes because they're so on the road and so many things can happen to an athlete. And when you look at the relationship more like that, rather than a one-off transaction, but more as a long-term relationship, you start to see that there's a lot more value than whatever check you're cutting in the next month to that athlete.
Right. I mean, that was so well said, Steve. It's really the word partnership instead of sponsorship. And I think that it's really critical to underscore that. As another example, the sponsors that work with different athletes that we talk about, a lot of times they'll reach out just on the fly and say, hey, like, how are things going? What does your competition season look like? Is there anything we can do to support you? Just out of nowhere. And it really is about building the rapport and building the relationship and ultimately building trust, right? Because that's what it comes down to. Sure, we're contractually agreeing to something. We're contractually agreeing to this partnership, but you're also building trust between parties, right? Between the athlete and the business. And looking at that as a long-term investment is super critical. And honestly, it helps you find the right organizations to work with as an athlete. You want to think about it long-term. Sure, the short-term, whether it be financial gain or opportunity or product, whatever else, sure, that's appealing. But if you look at it through the lens of partnership, you're playing the long game, which is good for everyone.
Something I want to get your thoughts on. My coach, Emily Kwok, has been on the podcast talking about this recently, and I know it's a passion project for her, and I'm sure that you and your athletes think the same. I mean, I know Fiona and Craig Jones have talked about this a lot recently, but this idea of a scarcity versus an abundance mindset when it comes to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I bring this up because there's a lot of businesses in the Jiu-Jitsu space that are frankly working under a scarcity mindset. Their focus is not so much how can I grow, it's how can I spend as little as possible.
Yes.
And trying to negotiate with people like that is extraordinarily painful. And part of the problem too is that cheapness attracts cheapness. So if you are that type of person where you run your business under the model that I'm going to save every penny, I'm going to slash every cost, you're going to attract other people who negotiate the same way, and it's kind of a path to misery. Whereas if you look at the people who do well in the sport, there's more of an abundance mindset. They give more freely of their time and their resources, and as a result, they attract others that also give more freely of their time and their resources. The person who really comes to mind for me about this is Christian Graugard, who built up BJJ Globetrotters mostly under the spirit of just giving without asking to receive.
Right.
And as a result, he's built up an organization that is probably second only to the IBJJF in terms of its impact organizationally on jiu-jitsu. I would love to get your thoughts on this and what your feelings are in terms of what you see when you're out there both talking to athletes and talking to their potential sponsors about this scarcity versus abundance mindset problem that we seem to have sometimes in the sport.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big topic. I would say that we see it through a variety of lenses. I think one of the most common lenses that we see it through is when people change gyms, right? When people change teams, it's there's a scarcity of athletes. Like, we absolutely need this one in some instances, I would say. But specifically from a lens of sponsorship, I would say that it's really difficult sometimes because the sport is still growing so much. I would say that there is a growing jiu-jitsu economy. We're not quite there yet. I would say that recent events this August have proven that there is money to be made and there is money being injected into the jiu-jitsu economy. But up until this point, I would say the scarcity piece, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with the small jiu-jitsu economy, meaning that athletes are not paid the same, as other sports, right? Like jiu-jitsu, in terms of just athletes at large, jiu-jitsu athletes make significantly less than other athletes in professional sports. I mean, it's not close. I would say that's one component of it. So from an athlete's point of view, any money in certain cases is great, right? If they accept a match for less than market value, to them, it may mean the world. They're super excited to compete for money, especially if it's the first time. But in those cases where they're accepting matches or, seminars or other events and things like that for less than what they're worth, they're actually undercutting themselves and starting at a lower threshold. From a sponsorship standpoint, getting athletes to represent them as cheap as possible is usually where the conversation starts. I'm not going to lie. There are some organizations that I've been super lucky to talk to, and we've been super lucky to work with, that have been tremendous to negotiate and usually come to the table with a little bit higher than market value. Now, asterisks here, Margot, Brianna, Adele, all insanely successful in what they're doing. So to me, worth their weight in gold. And I think that makes the negotiation process really easy. But from a sponsorship standpoint, in general, I would say that usually, more often than not, they'll come to the table with a number that is, the lowest that I've seen in a while, or I know is the large. I would say the number that they come to the table with is, okay, this is the cheapest deal that I think I'm going to cut today. So this is the number I'm going to put to paper. And it's super common, especially I help out a lot of folks that are not, top 10 black belts. I do help out a lot of friends of mine that are colored belts that do have sponsorships, and the negotiation processes that we go through at the colored belt levels. I mean, it's crazy how low sponsors will come in at. And the scarcity piece, I think, is really interesting because they are coming in so cheap. What typically happens is if the athlete accepts those terms and decides, okay, this is where I'm going to be at for the next 6 months, year, I'm going to focus on maybe like selling their products for commission, for example. That's another way that the deal can go. What the sponsor does by doing that is they create this consternation with the athlete. Of the athlete knows, okay, like this is, my friend who's working with a different sponsor is making, X amount more, right? Now the athlete is, I would say, like on their heels a bit with the sponsor, and there's consternation between the sponsor and the athlete as opposed to partnership at that point, where the sponsor comes in and is trying to get the athlete on the cheap. The athlete agrees. Now they're starting of this like bad taste in their mouth almost. So it almost like poisons the relationship a little bit if the sponsor comes in too cheap, which happens a lot.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. As someone who has had to hire many people over the years, I would always tell people, avoid the temptation to try to go with the cheapest option.
Right.
Because yes, you'll probably find someone who will take your stink bid, or you'll probably find someone out there who's willing to take your basement offer. But that person is not taking that offer because they're excited to work with you. They're taking it for subsistence purposes.
Right.
And as soon as a better offer comes along, you better believe that they will jump ship to that person because you have no relationship with them. It is purely transactional. You've set the table that way, and so there's no reason for a person to continue with you. And you see this a lot at companies that are notoriously cheap, where the main factor that they consider when hiring is cost. How can we get people as cheap as possible? They tend to have the worst problems with turnover and ultimately the worst problems with growing and succeeding at their business because they have this revolving door of staff. And it's because no one wants to be there. People are only there because at one point in time, maybe they got desperate and they took the best offer they could, but they have no desire to work with you. They're just there because something better has not come along yet. But you better believe that as soon as something better comes along, they're going to be out the door in 10 seconds. And again, I see this a lot in athletes. I think that from my experiences, many companies that offer sponsorships in the jiu-jitsu space, they do so in a very predatory manner, where they're trying to get as much out of athletes while giving as little as possible. And in fact, I mean, podcasts, for example, I look at a lot of the other podcasts like ours and the sponsorships that they take. And most of those, as far as I can tell, don't actually get any money. There is some affiliate deal. They only get paid, and they get paid a small fraction if the podcast does the work of doing the sales. And the implication there is that the reach and the audience and the brand that the podcast exposes you to is worthless by default. So really, I think a lot of those things get undervalued. And for athletes, it's very much the same. There's a lot of athletes, again, as you mentioned, especially emerging athletes, who get paid literally in some cases $0 to promote other things. I have heard horror stories that, people out there wouldn't believe about bad experiences that people have had with jiu-jitsu sponsorships. Part of the reason why BJJ Mental Models has never taken a sponsorship for our podcast is because I have yet to see one that is actually worth it for the impact on quality that it would have on the show. Most of them are just not good offers, right? And I think that for athletes is very much the same thing. It's something about, again, like you said, maybe it's because this is still an emerging sport and it's still so small, or maybe it's just because it flies under the radar or attracts a certain type of person, but it's very hard for emerging athletes to find those good opportunities in the first place. And I'd love to know your thoughts on how athletes can even do that. Is there a way or an approach that those up-and-comers could use to actually get paid for this before they break out onto the big scene and, get their shot at CJI or ADCC?
Yeah, totally. That's a great topic. Networking, building relationships. I would say that a lot of the up-and-coming athletes are competing all the time. They're at local opens. They're doing submission-only tournaments. They're traveling every month to go get mat time. And subsequently, they're getting exposure. They're meeting people. What they're not typically told, that I think is a huge cheat code, is you should be networking at these events. Despite being tired, unfortunately, it's totally a part of the gig. As an athlete, you are also a small business. And once you're done competing, go shake hands, go to the booths, go introduce yourself, go talk to as many people as possible that you think are going to be interested in you. And if you don't know who those people are, talk to everyone, get to know people, because the colored belt progression is, that's where you're laying a foundation for your black belt career. And I think something that a lot of really successful black belt athletes do well is bring a community along with them, so that the time they get to black belt, they have folks who've been supporting them since blue belt or purple belt. And making those connections and building those relationships during your colored belt career is so critical to being successful monetarily at black belt, and having a community of support, brands, non-brands, right? Just folks like me, for example. I'd started watching Brianna when she was a purple belt, and she wound up becoming my friend. And that's, probably another 2-hour podcast episode. But I would say that building community through meeting people, going and introducing yourself at these events, going and meeting the folks at the sponsorship booths, shaking their hand, giving them their contact information. That's so critical. If you're not sure where to start, like sliding into DMs on Instagram of the sponsorship companies that you want to work with is not always the best way to do it. In fact, I actually don't recommend doing that at all. I think meeting the folks in person at these events that you're already going to and asking them to watch your matches, like, hey, I'm competing at this time. And that can be nerve-wracking, right? But doing the face-to-face and building that connection in person and building that rapport and subsequently community is going to increase your chances at sponsorship success down the road.
Something that I sometimes say when people ask about how to ask for a sale or something like this is, you made your sales a year ago. sales are a lagging indicator. A common mistake that people make is when they need a new job or they want to sell something, they'll just go to LinkedIn and just start cold messaging people. That is tremendously unattractive, right?
Yeah, which by the way, now that's automated. They use AI prompts to get in your inbox now. So yeah, it's totally wild.
Yeah. If I haven't heard anything from you ever before, or if maybe we met 3 years ago and you've never spoken to me, and then out of the blue, you message me and ask for something, that it's very unattractive because it's tremendously clear what you're doing. You're trying to get something without investing in the relationship. And when I say that your sales were made a year ago, what I mean is realistically, if you want to start actually making money at anything, you've got to start laying the foundation for that well in advance. Like you said, just waiting for the moment when you need money and then going and posting something on Instagram, selling a service is probably not going to work. Whereas if you've invested in that time in meeting people and getting your name out there, in exchanging value and proving your worth to people, it becomes way easier when the time comes to actually make that ask for something. I think the main challenge when people go out and ask, whether it be for money or an opportunity, is they don't cook the relationship first. They don't invest in the relationship. They basically do nothing, and then they come out and just do a cold ask without any reason why the other person should say yes. I find that a lot of the best opportunities that I get, they come from the investing into a relationship just over years and proving that I can be a giving person. I can be generous. I would say too, in the example that you brought up, if you wind up in a situation where you want to network and meet with potential sponsors and meet with other athletes, I would say don't underestimate the value of demonstrating worth to them and demonstrating that you understand the value of their time. So if, for example, you are just some rando blue belt, and maybe you want to go and get some help from, I don't know, I'm just going to pick on Robert Drysdale. Let's say I really want Robert Drysdale's jiu-jitsu advice. I mean, yes, I could message him cold and just ask him to do a rolling review for me, but if you offer to pay, you'll probably get a good response, right? People ask for things for free all the time in jiu-jitsu when, as you brought up, I mean, jiu-jitsu is still, it's an emerging industry. Most people for a reasonable rate will help you out. And I always encourage people, be willing to pay. Right? If you're going to go and ask someone to do something for you, be willing to give them something in exchange. And if you don't have money, I really think a skill swap is a highly underrated aspect of jiu-jitsu and a great way to get momentum and traction in this sport. A lot of emerging athletes don't have the funds to throw money around, but everyone has something they can do, and never underestimate the value of a skill set like that. At my gym, for example, you've got people from all walks of life. That's one of the things I love about jiu-jitsu, and we skill swap and trade all the time. If I need any sort of service done, the first place I look is to find out if there's anyone at my gym who offers that service. You're a great example of that too, right? Where you brought in a ton of expertise from the quote unquote real world. And there are very, very high level black belts who would kill for that kind of expertise. I think that in jiu-jitsu, sometimes we care so much about how good are you at actual jiu-jitsu that people forget their worth in other areas of life and how that can be applied to the sport, right? I mean, if you are a public school teacher, I guarantee you know so much more about pedagogy than your coach and the people around you.
Yeah.
And you could probably help out way more than you think you could. So if you don't have the money to offer value to people, always consider a skill swap, right? But I think warming the relationship and showing that you're willing to give before you ask is so important if you want to attract kind of the good types of relationships in this sport.
Yeah. I mean, it's a show of good faith, right? And there are sponsors out there that do watch the colored belts. They'll sponsor the colored belts and then they'll sponsor them all the way through their black belt career as well. They're interested in building that long-term partnership. So I really have to give the nod to the sponsors that are going about it that way. I really think that they're leading from the front in that capacity, but fostering the relationship is so critical. And also, I mean, by putting your best foot forward and showing good faith and saying, hey, like, how can I contribute to your brand in advance of having, a deal on the table? I mean, it is just good for business in general, right? Doing something for nothing just shows good character. Now, of course, that has to be within reason, right? Especially when, you are an athlete that generates income based on a, limited number of categories for revenue generation. But I would say that, fostering the relationship and showing good faith and just operating out of a place of, hey, I'm here to build the relationship and do the right thing, it pays off big time, like down the road for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I want to ask you here, because you mentioned this earlier, you talked about how sometimes in negotiations, people will come in and they'll just lowball you and they expect you to then highball them and try to meet in the middle, right? This is common negotiating advice where come in with the most ridiculous offer and they'll come in with the most ridiculous offer. And then at some point you guys will compromise at the true number. What are your thoughts on that approach to negotiation?
Oh, I hate it. I normally go about negotiation completely differently. First, I like to, I'll give some keys to success here and just some tricks of the trade. I usually like to ask what their vision is for working with the athlete or whoever I'm helping or advocating for. What's your vision for partnership? Talk to me about that. And I like to let the organization tell me, holistically, what are they looking for out of an athlete? What are they going to do from a brand standpoint, just as an organization over the next year or two? Like, where are they headed? And how does the athlete feather into that? So that's one thing. That's usually how I start the conversation is, let me get to know, who's on the other end of this negotiation exercise and what they're thinking at a high level before we get to the brass tacks. So that's the first thing I ask. The second thing I typically ask is, what is your budget? If I understand the budget that they're working with and how they budget in general, or if they budget even, because that's sometimes not an exercise that a company will go through, right? Like depending on how new their company is. But I usually like to ask how they budget. What is their budget? What is their budgeting process like? What dollars do they allocate towards athletes? That way I can kind of work backwards and reverse engineer how they're pricing the sponsorship for the athlete that we're talking about. So I usually start with kind of two big questions and let them share. Letting them share usually gives me enough to understand what the next step in the conversation is going to be. So to answer your question directly is I hate kind of going directly into like the number exercise. I like to start bigger picture and start with, okay, like how are they arriving at the number that they're about to share with me? Once we go through that, then I will typically ask, okay, well, what are you thinking in terms of sponsorship? Where would you like to start? And once they've kind of shared their process and, given me a peek into how their business runs, I've found that I get a little bit more flexibility in the negotiation because they're now aware that I'm looking to understand who they are as a company and how they run their business. I'm not just here to haggle with them. And maybe that's the consultant in me, to be honest with you. I really like to understand what's going on with the company's infrastructure before I get into talking about the athlete compensation and what the deal is going to look like, which works out really well for all of us because they typically pick my brain at some point throughout the process. So I can't help myself. I consult on the side. So that, that helps the entire exercise as well. But I would say going directly into numbers, just that does make it a fight then. It does make it a little bit of a match. And I don't really subscribe to that approach in negotiations. I don't think that it creates the partnership that we talked about earlier. So I like to ask open-ended questions, understand their budget, and then work from their budget numbers if they're willing to share those with me. If they're not willing to share those with me, that's totally okay. Then I usually ask something along the lines of, okay, well, do you tier your athlete sponsorships? If you do, what do those tiers look like? And then we continue from there.
Makes sense. I guess now is as good a time as any to talk about it. In terms of the dark patterns that people sometimes use when negotiating, one thing that you see a lot is when people try to exploit the anchoring bias. And for those who don't know what this means, basically with human beings, we have this bias towards the first piece of information we hear. Where this comes up in negotiating, you will hear this sometimes where people will say, start with a really, really ridiculously low offer with the idea that you're eventually going to compromise and move up towards your real number anyway. And the reason people tell you to do that is because due to humans having this anchoring bias, if I come out of the gate and I say, give me $10,000, you might balk at the number. Whereas if I come out of the gate and say, give me $100,000, but then I let you negotiate me down to $10,000, the idea is that you will be more satisfied with that number because you think you've gotten a deal. You've negotiated me down by this massive amount. So even though you've agreed to the same amount that I wanted you to pay, ultimately I kind of tricked you, right? I did a Jedi mind trick to make you happier with this offer than you otherwise would have been. And I agree with you. I cannot stand that approach. And for a variety of reasons. One reason is it's absolutely disingenuous. It runs contrary to the spirit of a successful partnership. You are trying not to help the other person and create an option for mutual gain. You are trying to deceive the other person into giving you money. And if you do this, that kind of behavior will pattern its way all throughout the relationship, because now the other person will mirror that behavior and you'll never be able to get a straight answer out of them either. The other problem is, if the other person is a savvy negotiator, they know exactly what bullshit you're trying to do. And they're going to run for the hills because they know that you're not a good faith negotiator. It's like, it reminds me of when people do the old shit sandwich for feedback, where they compliment you and then they deliver the criticism and then they compliment you again. It's such an overused pattern that everyone knows what you're doing. Like, you're not as smart as you think you are by doing that. And it's the same with trying to lowball someone, right? It's just going to hurt you more at the end of the day, trying to play those kinds of tricks. You're better off just being honest with what you can do. And if that means that you can't find a fit, then so be it. But at least you were honest and you upheld your principles.
Exactly. I think, man, you're hitting the nail on the head. I would say that issue runs rampant. And specifically, just some examples I can think of off the top of my head beyond sponsorship is when you get into the match agreements, right? When athletes are looking at negotiating dollars for matches. A lot of times an athlete will come in and say, I want this exorbitant amount of money. And the promotion will go, well, that's just not feasible. And then the promotion will actually have like a bad taste in their mouth, thinking, that this athlete is, one, really difficult to negotiate with, two, doesn't have a grasp on market rates and market value for these types of matches given their reach. Right. So, that runs rampant on the actual competition side as well. But to your point, the anchor bias component is, that's one of the biggest challenges when you're negotiating with people is folks think that that's the right way to do it. And it's just not. It's overused. It's also, again, disingenuous, like you said. So I think like a really great way to circumvent that, to tag on to what I said before, is just do your homework. Understand, again, what athletes may be working with the company that you're talking to, what athletes are getting paid by companies like the company that you're talking to, because that information can be shared with you. Like, call some friends, ask around if you can. A lot of times, athletes will be told, or it'll be contractually written in, that they can't talk about their pay, which, by the way, is something that you can negotiate. That is something that you can strike from the agreement. That is something you don't have to agree to, but it can get written in. So just hot tip. But doing your homework and understanding what a fair market value is, and understanding what will be meaningful to you as an athlete, is super important. And again, just operating in good faith, putting your best foot forward, and understanding what the sponsor's vision is, what their budget is, and what their plan is for you as an athlete is a great way to start the conversation.
Let me ask you something to follow up on what you just talked about. You mentioned market rate in jiu-jitsu for a sponsorship. And this is a fascinating subject of conversation when it comes to jiu-jitsu, because first of all, in jiu-jitsu, it's still such an emerging market and there's so little information out there that it's hard to even know what a market rate is. And I think part of what you're seeing with ADCC and CJI and just the feathers getting ruffled and all of this money getting injected into the sport was the lack of availability of that information allowed people to lowball athletes beyond probably what they should be getting paid. The market was not really efficient in that sense. Athletes were not getting a good rate. If someone can come in and disrupt the whole market that quickly, it tells you that, okay, there was some market inefficiency going on there and people were getting underpriced. But the other thing too is when it comes to establishing a fair rate assumes that the product is a commodity of some sense, right? I mean, if you want to talk about fair rates, you might be talking about the price of gas or the price of milk, right? A commodity that's interchangeable. And in all my walks of life, I have never encountered an industry where the thing you're trying to buy is less of a commodity than in jiu-jitsu. Every athlete is completely unique, right? And it's impossible to really compare apples to apples. So this makes it really difficult. Like I can tell you, for example, as being someone who, has a media outlet here and runs a lot of metrics, sometimes the things that get engagement are not at all what you would think they are. And sometimes the things that move the needle, it's not the people that you think it would be. There are people out there who have massive social footprints and followings, but their engagement is so bad that just, getting them to actually sponsor you or support you means basically nothing. Then there's people out there who have, maybe 2,000-3,000 followers on Instagram, but their ability to connect with people is so high that getting a shout out from them can move the needle tremendously. I mean, I don't want to name names here, but there are some small YouTube channels or Instagram accounts I've seen where when they retweet or reshare us, it leads to like significant measurable revenue for us overnight. There's also these really, really well-known athletes sometimes who, when they do the same, it doesn't move the needle at all. So it's really hard to just compare apples to apples here because every athlete is so different. So with that in mind, like how would you benchmark athletes then knowing that? Because it's more than just how many titles they have and how many Instagram followers do they have. It's also their ability to actually connect with their audience, right?
Right. Totally. I like to start with the baseline of their peer group. I think that, again, because you make great points, right? I think like market rate in jiu-jitsu is, it's challenging to come up with that because of all of the reasons that you listed. So I fully agree with it. But I think that we can begin to come up with what that looks like if we look at the peer group of the athletes. So folks that may be in their division, that are actively sponsored, that are competing, that are, getting paid to compete. Now, the peer group, looking at the athletes, right? Like, what are their followings? Do they have a YouTube channel? Are they on Flow Grappling regularly? Do they have quite a bigger platform than whomever I'm working with or advocating for? Those are all qualifying questions, right? But usually we start at the peer group. We keep it really simple and we just, work from there and say, okay, what type of engagement does your peer group have? What type of sponsorships do your peer group have? And who can we talk to, I guess, build kind of a small consensus around what we think is fair. And then once we have a benchmark for the athlete that I'm working with and I'm helping, that's our new baseline. And then we work upwards from there. We compete against ourselves, if you will, like the age-old jiu-jitsu adage, right? We continue to improve and iterate from there. Because to your point, it's really hard to, there isn't some massive jiu-jitsu compensation database that we can go query against that will show us like all of the fighter compensation over the last, 5-10 years for all of their matches and all of their sponsorships, right? Wouldn't that be awesome if that existed? But unfortunately, it doesn't. So we do have to go off the information that we have, connections that we have. And again, we have to benchmark against ourselves sometimes if we, are in a different situation, like colored belts is a great example. But fortunately, I would say people are really helpful. As tricky as some of these conversations can be sometimes, there are a lot of folks out there that are willing to help. And there are a lot of organizations like on the sponsorship side as well that are just absolutely crushing it. They've been amazing to work with and they're doing the right thing. And they'll actually say, hey, this is what they'll be transparent about what they're paying their top athletes. So that's been really nice as well. that's been really helpful. But yeah, again, creating a market rate is really difficult because each athlete is unique and each athlete is building their brand, on their own, right? Like outside of competition. There's YouTube, there's TikTok, there's Instagram, there's all of these different mediums for them to drum up engagement. A lot of successful jiu-jitsu athletes have built their communities on Twitch through gaming, and they're killing it. So, there's a variety of ways that athletes can build their brand and build their engagement. And then to your point, there's even muddier waters when you're looking at traction and engagement based on something like follower count, right? Like you'll have certain posts and you'll have material that will go out and the engagement will range. And it'll make no sense, right? Like someone with, 2,500 followers on Instagram can share something or engage with some content, and then that content will take off. You're like, wait a second, where is this coming from? So it's tricky for sure. There's no perfect blueprint for this.
Yeah. And I think it's important too for especially athletes when they're trying to promote their value to understand all of the ways that they can deliver value. People get really hung up on how many Instagram followers do you have, but that's not really the most important metric if you're looking to sponsor an athlete. In fact, it can be a deceptive metric. And I would even encourage, as people on the sponsor side of the table, I would encourage people in that position to consider almost disregarding things like Instagram follower count as a metric that you use when basing sponsorships, because it's almost useless. It doesn't really tell you a lot about actual engagement. And on top of that, there's other places where engagement can be tremendously meaningful. Maybe the person doesn't have a big Instagram following, but they have a massive email newsletter, or maybe they have like you said, a massive following on Twitch, or they're really heavily engaged on Reddit, on RBJJ, or maybe they actively engage in several private discords where they have the attention of very important people. Maybe they have none of that, but they just train in a room full of killers, right? And they can kind of be that connective glue that ties people together. I always encourage people to give themselves more credit for the value they bring than they may think they have. People often think, well, I'm not Brianna, I'm not Margot, I can't carry that kind of weight around, I can't leverage that name. But you know what? I bet if you sat down and thought about it, there's probably something you can offer that no one else can offer. And I think a good agent will help you find that and help you pitch that. That's one of the reasons why it's important to have representation, is because they can often communicate your value better than you can. It's very hard, as you mentioned, to advocate for yourself because we all spend 100% of our time in our own heads. It's hard for us to step back and look at ourselves the way a third party would look at us. That's exactly what an agent does. And they can also be that buffer between you and the sponsor so they can speak on your behalf. And that kills any awkwardness that you may otherwise feel having to puff yourself up. I know jiu-jitsu people hate to do that. they hate to self-promote and talk about how many followers they've got and how great they are. That's the agent's job. You get a good agent, they'll do that for you. Now, all of this though raises the question, Sara, how does one go about getting that kind of representation in jiu-jitsu at any level? If they feel like, man, I am either not having success getting sponsorships and getting fight deals on my own, or I know I'm getting lowballed, or I'm doing it all right, but I just hate doing it. How do people go about finding a Sara Rafferty for themselves?
Oh man, I wish I had a really quick and easy answer to it, but I will say that I fell into this. This was not something that I, set out to do. It just organically happened. And I will say that there are people out there that do this for a living, and this is their service that they offer to the grappling community. And they are pretty public about it. They advertise their management services all over the place, and some of the top athletes do use them. But what I will say is, what I would say makes me a little bit different is I really feel like I'm more of an advocate, because I'm not necessarily doing this to build like my own management business. Not yet, at least. That could be in the future. That could be a future state thing. I'm definitely open to it. And the girls and I have talked about it. But I would say that looking at, depending on where you're at in your athletic career, if you're a colored belt and you are, trying to get sponsors, or you are just struggling to navigate a negotiation exercise, I think that there is likely an opportunity through your gym. There are likely folks that, to, call back to what you were talking about earlier, Steve, like each jiu-jitsu gym is a microeconomy. There are folks in the gym that likely have the skills that are needed that can help with that. Not to sign them up for this activity, but that's where I would start. Secondarily, hit me up. I'm totally open to talking to people. I talk to people all the time. I give advice like it's going out of style. I just want to help. And I think that there are a tremendous number of people like me out there that want to see positive change in the sport, that are willing to do just that, contribute in a way that's from an ethical place, that's really to just help the athletes, and then also similarly help the sponsors as well. I've gotten some good feedback that it's been nice to just kind of come to one person and work through negotiations that way. But I would say that I would love to clone myself 150 times and then just spin up a super cool organization. And all we did all day was make this process just way easier for jiu-jitsu athletes and sponsors and organizations that are putting on grappling matches and things of that nature. So I would love to do that. Maybe one day I'll finish the clone machine I've been building for the past 5 years. But yeah, I think that there are folks in the jiu-jitsu community that are totally equipped to help in the capacity that we've been talking about. And I think that they exist, but I am totally open to helping whoever needs help. If people want to reach out and just have a conversation and just need, direction on who should they talk to, I'm happy to dip into my network and see if there's anybody that I know that can help out.
Nice. I will say this, all of my office worker brothers and sisters out there, it's your turn to rise up and unite here.
Yes, let's do it.
Yeah, hobbyists always beat themselves up because they're surrounded by this room of killers. And I think, I'm just not very good at this. What value do I add to the team?
Tons.
This is your moment.
Yes.
One thing that you probably have at your disposal if you work any type of office job is a lot more negotiating experience than you think. And even if you're not representing a world-class 10-time world champion with tons of money, even if there's just a person in your gym who needs some help getting their competitive career off the ground, do a skill swap. Tell them you'll act as that buffer. You'll help them negotiate. They give you some private lessons in exchange. It's a good deal for everyone. And if it grows from there, then you can talk about money exchange at some point in the future. But even just a skill swap, right? If you really want to help your team, you would be amazed how much value that adds to your athletes to take that stress off their plates, because then they can focus on actually going out there and doing the competition, putting in the work as an athlete. They don't have to wear this other hat. But that said, though, Sara, if people do want to work with you or they want to ask you questions or contact you, how do they do that?
Yeah, they can find my Instagram. My handle is _Rafferty, RAFFERTY. I have a link tree up there with my website and a contact form. So if you need assistance, go ahead and reach out. If I do get inundated, I will probably float back a reply and just say, hey, let's get on the calendar and let's have a chat. But yeah, that's the best way to reach out to me and contact me. Happy to help.
Amazing. Now, one other thing I want to ask, just a bit off the beaten path here.
Sure.
You're pretty well connected. Who are the emerging up-and-comers that nobody knows about yet that you think are going to be the next big thing?
Oh my gosh, Steve, putting me on the spot. Man, I mean, that's tough. I train at Art of Jiu-Jitsu, so I feel like that's kind of cheating because everyone at AOJ is phenomenal and really, really very good.
But even then, there's probably some purples, maybe some browns there that people aren't even familiar with yet, right? That
yes,
might not get the attention they deserve until they get that black belt.
Yeah, absolutely. My friend Caro is incredible. She's a purple belt in the featherweight division. She competes with big, long, colorful braids. She's amazing. She's next. She's for sure next. She's one to watch. Check her out. She also owns a pastry company. So she sells Brazilian pastries at competitions. She's tremendous. Her Instagram handle is Caro Vallejo JJ. So CaroLlejoj. Yeah. She's the next best thing.
Amazing.
Yes.
Awesome. You know, that seems like a pretty sneaky trick, right? Fattening up all your opponents with pastries so that they can't go when it's competition time.
Yes. She's a really compelling story. She moved here from Brazil to compete and chase her dream of becoming a black belt world champion. And she was selling water bottles on the side of the road in Brazil to make ends meet and to get where she is now. And she trains at AOJ. She's a tremendous athlete. She does everything right. She teaches, she trains every day, and she competes a tremendous amount. So she's one to watch.
Amazing. Well, I will put a link to your Instagram and also her Instagram in the show notes just to make it easy for people to find them. If anyone follows Caro, and I'm telling you, if in 3 years from now, she's like the next big thing, Sara called it right here on BJJ Mental Models.
Yes.
There you go. We were groundbreakers here. We identified the trend before it happened.
We were. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I'll also put a link to all of our stuff. Everything we make lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. Every episode of the podcast is there. You can sign up for the newsletter. All of that is entirely free. We also have a database of concepts. So if you want to learn more about the whole spectrum of jiu-jitsu and you're looking for a Wikipedia of concepts for jiu-jitsu, the best one that I'm aware of lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. We also float the boat with BJJ Mental Models Premium, closing in on about 600 subscribers there, and I just really can't recommend that enough in terms of why you'd want to join. One of the things you'll get is as far as I know, the world's biggest library of audio-style jiu-jitsu masterclasses. I say masterclass because we often get equated to that. If you think of that service, we get some of the best minds in the sport and we get them to share their tricks, their tips, their advice, structured into an audio course format. If you're a big fan of Audible or, again, masterclass, I definitely recommend it. Sara, a lot of your people are on there. We've got material from Margot, from Brianna, probably Adele by the time this episode goes live, if not coming soon. And we're always looking to expand that. You also get access to a whole series of professional jiu-jitsu podcasts exclusively available to the BJJ Mental Models Premium Podcast Network. If you want to listen to, for example, Emily Kwok's podcast or Drew Foster's meta-analysis podcast, that's where all of that lives. And on top of that, if you upgrade, you get rolling reviews. Many of your people, like again, Margot and Brianna, are on our rolling review team. So if you've ever thought to yourself, man, I would love to have someone of that caliber, someone who's gone to like the highest levels, provide feedback on my dumb jiu-jitsu, this is how you do that. And that's also how you support Sara's team as well. And interestingly, this year we launched a new audio course called Grappling with Confidence. Specifically, what it was intended is to be a series of lessons from some of the best minds in the sport about how to maintain and develop your confidence in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It was a 6-part series with Joseph Chen. God, there's going to be a lot of names here that you know. Margot Ciccarelli, Rafael Lovato Jr., Sarah McMahon, Dante Leone, and more. And it was just a really great series of conversations. And one of the things that stood out to me was Margot and Elizabeth Clay were specifically talking about the importance of confidence when it comes to negotiation. Elizabeth Clay especially had some very interesting stories about how the kind of confidence that you build up in competition is just as important when you're going to the negotiation table because you have to stand up for your worth. Really interesting chats. All of that's available on BJJ Mental Models Premium. So if you want a 7-day free trial of that, go to bjjmentalmodels.com or hit the link in the show notes. But with all of that said, Sara, thank you so much. I love these kinds of conversations.
Yes.
I think this one was very unique, and I'm so happy that we had a chance to do this.
Pleasure was mine, Steve. You're awesome. I love what you guys are doing at BJJ Mental Models. You guys are such a great add to the grappling community, and it was an honor.
Honor for me as well. A huge honor, as they say. Thanks a lot, Sara. We'll talk to you soon, and everyone else will talk to you next week. Take care.